where the story of the morning is that Jordan Schultz has released a report saying that the Commanders and the Texans have significant interest in trading for Deebo Samuel, that the Broncos and one other team had interest, but they were just kind of sniffing around. What do you make of this report? Does this prove to you in any way that there is an actual trade market for Deebo, or are you still skeptical that this is a lot of talk, but in reality everybody's waiting for the release of the player?
Yeah, so let's set the stage and think about how we got here, right? End of the season meeting, Deebo Samuel meets with Kyle Shanahan, and he says, I want a fresh start. I'm going to demand a trade. And after the year before that, John Lynch had said, we're not in the business of getting rid of really good football players, which then brings us to this week here in Indianapolis for the NFL Combine. John Lynch met with the media the other day, and one of the questions he received, are you looking to trade Deebo Samuel? What's the status on him? And John Lynch said, you know what? We don't really want to trade Deebo Samuel, but we are going to honor his wish, honor his request, and we're going to give him a fresh start. And what's very interesting is that usually when general managers and head coaches take the podiums here at the NFL Combine, they don't talk about players on other teams. But D'Amico Ryan said flat out, yeah, we're interested in Deebo. And obviously he has familiarity with Deebo from his time as serving as the Niners defensive coordinator with this team. And then he used that resume to land the Texans head coaching job. And now the Texans are being mentioned as a real suitor for Deebo. And so there are a couple of ties here between Deebo, where he might go, and some of the teams interested. The Houston Texans, as we noted, but also the Washington Commanders. Adam Peters used to be the assistant general manager for the Niners. He's now running football operations for Washington, and both the Texans have a need for wide receiver because Tank Dell's future is uncertain after that brutal injury. They have Nico Collins, who is a premier wideout, and then the Washington Commanders are trying to go all in, take advantage of Jane Daniels being on that rookie contract. They have Terry McLaurin, but there are questions at that wide receiver 2 spot. And Adam Peters has that familiarity with Deebo as well. He was a huge fan of his in that front office, which drafted Deebo out of South Carolina in the second round back in 2019. And he's gone on to have a really good career, but ever since signing that contract extension, as we know, Larry, the numbers have gone down a little bit. Other teams said to have interest, according to Jordan Schultz, who's had an eventful week, had that scuffle with Ian Rappaport at the Starbucks right down the road. Then he broke this story about Deebo. Then he broke the contract between Matthew Stafford and the Los Angeles Rams here at the Combine. News is just flying around. He mentioned the Pittsburgh Steelers in need of a wideout and the Denver Broncos also in need of a wideout. They have Cortland Sutton, but he's going into the final year of his contract. They haven't been able to land a long-term contract extension, and so they need another weapon. And so it seemed impossible, coming back to my original start, that Deebo is going to get dealt. But you had John Lynch saying, we're going to honor his trade request. Now you have a couple of teams who look to be willing to trade for him. And when Schultz says that talks are starting to progress and the interest is real, I think it's worthy of taking notice of that.
Well, let's talk about, what this may actually mean. Here's the tweet is, sources say the Commanders and Texans have had significant interest in trading for 49er wide receiver Deebo Samuel, with talks progressing in recent days, sources tell NFL on Fox. Other teams, including the Steelers and Broncos, have also checked in, but Houston and Washington are believed to be the most aggressive. And it's got this big breaking news thing from NFL insider Jordan Schultz. So good week for Jordan Schultz, outside of the Starbucks thing. But what do you? Okay, one, there was a lot of people that were like, hey, look, Deebo is not going to be traded. Deebo is going to be cut. This is the only thing that, I had people lecturing me in my chat a week ago. Matt Barrows came out and said the only thing that makes sense, Dan Graziano, the only thing that makes sense is that the Niners will wind up cutting Deebo. Well, what do you make of this? Are you saying that is this the way this works? Now tell me if I'm wrong. From what I read, the 49ers will take a cap hit if they release him. They'll take a more significant cap hit if they trade him. But it sounds like they may be willing to take a more significant cap hit to get some compensation. So is that accurate? And if that's accurate, doesn't that kind of bode well for the Niners' chances of getting decent compensation? Because are you really taking a bigger cap hit for a late 5th or early 6th round draft choice? Probably not.
Right, and something that I've talked about all along, if the Niners are willing to trade Deebo, are they willing to absorb that cap hit knowing that maybe they think the compensation coming back as far as the NFL draft is worthy of getting rid of him? Because if you do trade him away pre-June 1, the dead money charge for 2025 is $31.5 million. The cap savings is $15.6 million. If the Niners were to trade him post June 1, the dead money charge would be $10.7 million. The cap savings would be 5.1. What the Niners might be thinking here is what you alluded to. Let's say they get a 3rd round pick back. That's higher than what I thought they were ever going to get for a declining player coming off a bad year, going into the final year of his contract, when he's also probably going to be looking for a contract extension. Maybe they like the compensation coming back and they're willing to absorb all of that money now instead of spreading it out over the next couple of years. And then John Lynch mentioned a lot during his press conference earlier this week. 1, we need to get younger. 2, we need to reset the salary cap. And so he said, we're going to fulfill that wish for Deebo. We might trade him away. Then I asked him, there's some reports coming out this week from Indy, John, about trading away Brandon Ayuk. He did not shoot those down. And he said, yeah, at some point, we have to reset the salary cap and we have to replenish the cupboard as far as talent on this team. But we do have to tap into our youth and we have to get a little bit younger. And so this wide receiver room could look a lot different. And I never thought that a Deebo trade was going to be possible unless the compensation is good enough. And that's the only way that this makes sense, because if you're taking on $31.5 million in dead money and you're only saving $15 million, you're eating a lot of cash there. But again, you're not having to spread it out. I will also say this. There's always a way to pull off financial gymnastics. And so when we talk about trade rumors on my channel, your channel, there's always people saying it's not going to happen. It's impossible. Why are you even talking about this? But there are so many ways to manipulate the cap. And so maybe the Niners are finding a way to potentially do that to soften and absorb the financial blow that they might take here.
You know, it's interesting. Do you think that they are open-minded to these cap hits on the receivers potentially because this is the same offseason, that there's so much change to their cap, because the Purdy deal's looming, a Kittle extension could be looming, a restructure for Fred Warner could be looming. They have lots of ways to play with their cap and kind of tinker with the numbers. Because they do have some significant moves that they can make. Do you think that makes the trades of the wide receivers more plausible, just because you do have big things that you're moving around on your money structure, and maybe because of that there's some wiggle room? Otherwise, it does seem very interesting. To me, it sounds like they may move off of both receivers. But I'm shocked that there's a market for either. I mean, I guess I'll ask you this. Are you more surprised if there's a trade market for Deebo, or more surprised if there's a trade market for Ayuk? Ayuk's better, but Ayuk's coming off a major injury, where Deebo had a good game, against Miami in the second half of the year. But, generally people feel like he's done and he's not the same player that he was. So how do you see the two receivers? How do you think the rest of the league does? Because Deebo's only 28, and the Niners don't have a great offensive line. Teams may be looking at him going, you know what? Behind our line, he's only 28. He's not 33 like Devontae. You know what? I think they're wrong. I think he's done at 28. But how do you see it?
As we know, teams are always bullish. Teams are always stubborn, and they always think, okay, if he comes into our situation, our scheme, with our quarterback, our playmakers, our play calling, our play designs, we'll get him back on track. But I just don't see how the value is all that high For Deebo, who's older, who's been injury prone, who really has been a massive disappointment since signing that contract extension after the All-Pro year going into 2022. He's coming off the worst year of his career. He's 20 pounds overweight. He looks slow. He played slow. Tackle breaking numbers were down. Separation numbers were down. Wasn't finding the end zone at the same clip. And then with Brandon Ayuk, he's coming off a severe injury, and we're not sure when he's going to be able to come back. And the Niners just signed him to a $30 million per year contract, $120 million over 4 years. And so when other teams are looking at the value of both wideouts, Ayuk's younger, but he's coming off the knee injury. Deebo's older, coming off a bad year, but he's a little bit cheaper. And if they don't sign him to a contract extension, is it just one and done to see what they can do, especially for a team like the Commanders? If they decide to go all in here in 2025, get a legit number 2 and running mate next to Terry McLaurin, you give Jane Daniels another weapon. He's on his rookie contract. They figure it out defensively because they have to get better on that side of the ball. They gave up 55 points in the NFC Championship game. The other thing, too, that kind of sticks out to me, going back to what you had said prior to you asking me about the value that other teams might see in these two players, are the Niners looking at a little bit of a reset on the salary cap. And the salary cap this year will be $279.5 million, something in that neighborhood. It's never been that high. That's a record. But the salary cap is going to continue to go up and up and up because business is booming in the NFL. And so that number will continue to rise. And so are the Niners looking at this situation saying, okay, it might be dire right now, but let's eat the cap hits for Ayuk and Deebo now so that we don't have to worry about it later. We can backload this Brock Purdy contract. And then with backloading that deal, we eat the money now for the 2 wide receivers. Then next year and in the foreseeable future, that frees up some cap space as the salary cap also goes up in the future too. And those are some of the financial gymnastics and maybe some of the conversations that the Niners are having. And I just keep thinking about what John Lynch had to say. It was like a stunning moment. I turned to Grant to my right, and I'm like, am I tripping? Or did he not shoot down the Brandon Ayuk trade? He really emphasized multiple times, we need to get younger, and we need to reset the cap. And is this the way that the Niners are kind of going about that right now? Because these are some interesting developments this week in Indy.
No question. And then, people saying, well, what's the cap situation of a team like the Commanders? They have a ton of cap. Available cap room. I'm looking at the, overthecap.com. Number 1 cap team as far as the most to spend, New England, $127 million. Raiders are second, $96.4. Commanders are third at $81.9 million. The Niners have a lot of cap room because they've earmarked a lot of it for Purdy, but they're down the list at $50.1. And as far as the Texans, they don't have very much cap room at all. Only $4.6 million of cap room. Heck, then who's in the worst situation on the cap? The Saints are $47 million under, or over the cap, I should say, and the Browns are $22 million over. The Bills are $10 million over. Another team that's also right there with them is Seattle at $6.8 million over, and I'm reading right now that DK Metcalf to the Packers could happen. The Packers have a lot of good receivers, but they don't have a number 1. They're looking for a number 1. Is DK going to be their number 1? And you see that deal coming down?
Well, I was in front of John Schneider, the Seahawks general manager, earlier this week, and he was pretty adamant that they're not going to trade DK Metcalf. And a lot of the talk, a lot of the conversations here in Indy is that DK Metcalf is not going anywhere. Obviously, we know that that can change, and obviously we know that Schneider could be saying that to try to increase the value, to try to be bullish right now, to drive up that price tag. But from what I've kind of gathered, a lot of people are expecting that DK is going to be back with the Seahawks, but things could change, of course, because the Packers are also a team. They have a lot of good wide receivers and a deep wide receiver room. They don't necessarily have a star right now, though.
What would be shocking to you as compensation for Deebo? What would really make you go, wow, I did not see that? Because I was on record about 10 days ago saying 5th-round pick. He's worth a 5th. They're not going to get more than a 5th-round pick. But now I'm reading this, it makes me feel like, you know what? Maybe they are going to get more than a 5th.
Yeah, I didn't think it was going to be any higher than a 4th. I thought that was best case scenario. But could they somehow wheel and deal and get a 3rd? Could they get a 2nd-round pick? it might have to come from a team that has a couple of second rounders or maybe a couple of thirds. And the Niners say, look, we'll trade him away, but we have to take on this huge dead money charge. And so if we have to take that on, you don't really have to worry about that. You at least have to give us a third or a second. I would be shocked if they got a second or a third. But if they're able to pull that off, that's pretty good compensation coming back, because that fits what John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan want. If they want to get younger, if they want some cost-controlled players, if they want to reset this roster, replenish the cupboard a little bit, work off the momentum from that 2024 draft, you can get a really solid player in the third round, in the second round, who could be an impact player for you. Shoot, that could be a starter here in 2025 and in the future.
I know this is going to make all the cap people head explode, and it might be an ignorant question, so I forgive me if it is. What the Commanders? We know Jaden Daniels and Ayuk are buddies. I mean, and Ayuk wants to play with Jaden Daniels. What do you think of the idea of trading both of the Niner receivers at the same time to the Commanders? And I mean, I know it sounds crazy, but what do you think of this? How about Deebo and Ayuk to the Commanders for Luke McCaffrey and a second-round pick? You get a receiver coming back who's related to one of your stars. He's not an awesome receiver, but he's a receiver. He wasn't making a huge impact for them. They get two weapons to try to run with Philly in that division, and they give up one draft choice, one day two draft choice. Or is that? I mean, the Commanders have the cap room to make all this work. But what do you think of something like that? Because I know Deebo to the Commanders is intriguing, and obviously Peters knows him. But man, if you really want to make Jaden Daniels happy, you get him Ayuk and Deebo.
Yeah, and as we know, Ayuk is really close with Jaden Daniels, and the Commanders were being mentioned as a team around this time last year, where if the Niners did not sign Brandon Ayuk to that contract extension, they were looked at as one of the teams. Had the money, fit. Ayuk and Daniels are boys. And, of course, the Adam Peters connection cannot be ignored. And what a story that would be, right? Not only the Niners trading both wide receivers away, but then them playing the Philadelphia Eagles, who have turned into a pretty big rival for San Francisco. They'd be facing them 2 times a year. The Commanders are in a spot right now where they have nearly $82 million in cap space this year. You throw out those numbers in 2026, $150+ million in cap space. And then in 2027, obviously this is very early, but they're still top 10 in available cap room at $239.6 million. And so they could absorb a couple of these big contracts. Of note, Deebo Samuel, as I noted earlier, entering the final year of his contract. And I don't think it happens, but the Commanders are a team. They've been linked to Myles Garrett. They're now linked to Deebo Samuel. They made it to the NFC Championship game. And when you're winning and you're ahead of the rebuilding process like the Commanders are, I thought that they were going to be feisty in 2024. I thought they were going to be a borderline playoff team. Nobody expected them to be a Final Four team. We saw against Philly, they were outclassed, and Philadelphia had so much more talent, and their Cinderella run ran out. But shoot, they have cap space, they have some needs, and their time to win is right now. And kind of the formula to compete for Super Bowls across the NFL that we've really seen from a team building standpoint over the last few years is teams trying to go all in and take advantage of their quarterbacks being on that rookie contract.
Yep.
It happened with Patrick Mahomes early. It happened with Joe Burrow. It happened with Jalen Hurts. It happened with Carson Wentz and the Eagles when they won the Super Bowl in 2017. Now the Commanders are trying to do that. The Texans are trying to do that. The Bears are going to be aggressive. They're going to be big players in free agency. And so I don't think the Niners trade away both players, but I do expect the Commanders to make big splashes.